Welcome to the Lakeside Garden Club. This is the third in our series of lectures, presentations, and slides from good local experts on gardening. And we very much enjoy Greg Rubin. This is not his first visit to us. He's an expert on California natives.
There's me and there's my company. And there's my cover photo from one of our gardens. And you hear me okay, right? All right, well, let's go. So many of you guys know that I started in this about a lot of years ago. And I left aerospace to become a landscape contractor in the mid 90s. And since that time, we've done over 750 native landscapes in Southern California, including the infill of the Del Mar Thoroughbred Racetrack. That was a big project for us. The Lux Art Institute in Encinitas, and then Sanderling at Aviara. And basically, if you can get Aviara to go with natives, you can get anybody to go with natives. That's out in Carlsbad. And you probably know that we have a couple books out. The first one came out in 2013 with Lucy Warren, and the California Native Landscape. That's more of a textbook and kind of goes step by step through the whole process of designing and installing and caring for native landscapes. And then later we came out with a book that's more of a plant selector, or plant encyclopedia, called The Drought-Defying California Garden. That was in 2016. So why do native plants in the first place? For one thing, they give us a sense of place. We're kind of forgetting what California used to look like. We're so busy turning it into South Florida. When you install a native landscape, you're also creating habitat. And nothing provides better habitat than the plants that these creatures, the birds and butterflies and lizards and so on, actually evolved with. And if you design them correctly, a native landscape should be lower maintenance. And of course, most importantly, it uses 60 to 90% less water. And that's pretty significant. That is a huge difference. We're typically, in Lakeside, we're probably shooting for watering about once every 7 to 10 days in summer. Most people in Lakeside are watering their landscapes anywhere from 3 days a week to every day. So it's a big difference. But there's a lot of misconceptions about natives. First off, that they're going to be dead or dormant for half the year. Well, I can tell you, if they look dead or dormant for half the year, I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you right now. And that's really a failure of design. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. They have a reputation for being fire bombs. And in fact, we're discovering that it might be just the opposite when you give them a little bit of light hydration. In fact, we just finished up a 5-year study with the US Navy on the fire-resistant aspects of native landscapes, and the results were very promising. And it showed that lightly irrigated native landscapes can be some of the most fire-resistant materials out there. That's been borne out not only by the tests, but experience when we have had about 30 of our clients go through major fire events, and knock wood, we haven't lost a single house yet. Natives have gotten a undeserved reputation for being difficult. Well, the difficulty lies in actually trying to apply ornamental horticulture to native ecology, which is a very different approach. And what we're about is trying to emulate the natural ecology in these landscapes. And finally, they have a reputation for being too large for most yards, which is why I have this picture of this courtyard garden to show you that there are many native landscape plants that are scaled beautifully for even small gardens. So let's start with the basics. One of the things that's been kind of ignored by horticulture is that they're highly symbiotic, which means they share resources with one another. In fact, they organize themselves into plant communities, such as chaparral, coastal sage scrub, mixed evergreen, grasslands, etc. Mulch is often the defining factor for those communities. And by mulch, I mean basically either organic or inorganic. And it's actually more than just a nice top dressing. Mulch is integral to the ecology of the plant community. So the plant communities that like organic mulch include, chaparral, maybe to a lesser extent coastal sage scrub, certainly oak woodland, and mixed evergreen forest. These are very dense type habitats that are constantly shedding leaves and bark and forming a natural duff layer at the base that gets highly compacted and then becomes an important part of the overall soil ecology. On the other end of the spectrum, we have inorganic or no mulch, and the plant communities that do best with those kinds of mulches are coastal strand or desert, riparian, which is streamside woodland, or even grassland. And one of the keys to success is to actually group plants by the mulch that they like. That doesn't mean that they all have to be exactly from chaparral. Basically, if they like the same mulch, they typically all get along together, more or less. And if you have 5 species from a given mulch group, that's usually sufficient to create enough biodiversity for the planting to be stable. So it's all right to mix chaparral, coastal sage scrub, and oak woodland plants together. They'll all pretty much get along because they all like an organic mulch to one degree or another. In the second book, we actually talk about mulch, and it's pretty much the only book that I know of out there on landscaping that actually emphasizes appropriate mulches for the plant community. And we have this little table in there that shows, kind of where you live, where you're located, and the type of preferred mulch for that area, and what plant communities do best in that area with that mulch. So in other words, if you live along the immediate coast, those are typically regions of inorganic mulch. The plants are small, they're often living on bluffs, they're widely spaced, they're not putting down a lot of organic matter. So the mulch tends to be more like sand, rocks, and gravel, cobble. And certainly you would do very well with either coastal strand or grassland plant communities. And when I say sustainable, that means that they pretty much could exist without irrigation, that they would require almost no artificial life support. However, I don't recommend that for a number of reasons. We actually do like to give a little bit of supplemental irrigation, even though they're highly drought tolerant landscapes, because the landscapes look more vigorous, they're dusted off, and it actually has consequences for fire resistance. So we never truly take these things completely off irrigation during the summer months. We give them along the coast, it'd be the equivalent of fog drip, basically. But it makes a big difference in how these landscapes perform. Now, if you're in an inland location like Lakeside, you have a very wide range of options open to you. You can be using organic type plant communities or inorganic mulch plant communities. Within organic, you have coastal sage scrub and chaparral, oak woodland, pine forest. And then in inorganic, you could be using coastal strand, grassland, desert, or pinyon juniper woodland. Then when you get out to Anza Borrego, you're back to inorganic again. It kind of cycles through. And at that point, the easiest plant communities would be the desert plant community that you live in, or even pinyon juniper woodland. You could use some of the coastal strand plants, but you'd want to put those in the shade because they would get vaporized in the desert. But yeah, the mulch is kind of important to the sustaining of the plant community. You wouldn't want to have a desert garden and put that redwood mulch all around your palo verdes and agaves and stuff, because it can actually rot them. They really want sand, rocks, and gravel, just like the area they naturally come from. I hope that makes sense. So the soil biology is really important to native plant communities, and by trying to emulate the natural ecology. We try to provide the right conditions for this very complex and poorly understood ecosystem to just naturally develop on its own. And some of the important components in the soil include mycorrhizae, myco meaning fungus and rhizae meaning root. There are major groups of these. The two most common are either endomycorrhizae and ectomycorrhizae. Endomycorrhizae, don't worry, you're not going to be tested on this, but endomycorrhizae actually forms little vesicles inside the cells, and the fungi penetrate in there and they're coiled up inside those little vesicles there, and there's an exchange happening. The fungus is actually metabolizing micronutrients from the inorganic soil and rock. It's also storing water, and then it's sharing that water and nutrition with the plants by, in this case, penetrating into the root cells. And what the fungi get out of the deal, their symbiosis, they get 20% of the carbohydrate production of the plants, because fungi don't have chlorophyll. They can't photosynthesize. They can't make their own sugars, so they get it from the plants. And in return, they provide this nutrition. They increase the available root mass by about 1,000 times. They store and move water. And so it's a true symbiosis. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Ectomycorrhizae perform a similar function, but their physiology is a little different in that ecto forms sheaths around the outer root cells of the root hairs, and it forms little nets around these outer cells. And so the exchange of moisture, nutrition, and sugars is happening through the cell membranes, not internally like they are with the endomycorrhizae. Endomycorrhizae is the primary fungus of desert and grasslands and partly in coastal sage scrub. Ectomycorrhizae is the primary mycorrhizae for our evergreen forests, oak woodland. Endomycorrhizae is completely microscopic. That image is actually a scanning electron microscopic picture that was taken with staining, whereas ectomycorrhizae can be seen with the naked eye, and certainly their fruiting bodies can be seen because they're mushrooms. So not all mushrooms are ectomycorrhizal, but certainly some of our best eating mushrooms like chanterelles and morels and truffles are actually ectomycorrhizal fruiting bodies. So when we go hunting for them, we're actually eating the fruiting bodies of the mycorrhizae that are supporting that forest that you're running around looking for your mushrooms. And that's why we have to be careful, because all that disturbance can really have a negative impact on this very shallow ecology. It's right under the mulch. There's also other actors in the soil biology. Frankia is a real interesting one. What it does, it actually allows plants that aren't legumes to become nitrogen fixers. And one of the most famous groups of plants that aren't legumes but are very important nitrogen fixers include the ceanothus, the wild lilacs. And they will form these little white nodules on the root systems. And it's often misidentified. There was a story at Las Politas Nursery, may it rest in peace, in Escondido, where these beautiful, lush, gorgeous ceanothus go out to a contractor who 2 days later returned them and wanted his money back. That was because they pulled them out of the pot and they saw these white nodules all over the root system. And they took them over to the extension office, and unfortunately they told them they were pathogens. So these guys didn't realize how lucky they were that they actually had potted nursery plants with Frankia on the roots. So they got their money back, and of course I bought up all that ceanothus. They didn't know how lucky they were. Another part that's really important is the crusts that form. Many of you have been hiking, have seen cryptogamic or cryptobiotic crust. This is a little non-vascular plant community in itself and made up of mosses and fungi and bacteria and lichens. And it takes years to form, usually a minimum of about 7 years to form, but it can be destroyed with a single footstep or hoof step. And what it does is it acts as a nitrogen fixer for the whole plant community. And it also discourages non-native plants from growing. Only the natives will typically grow through this stuff. So nowadays, when they do ecological restoration, they'll actually harvest the crust and store it beforehand. And then when they're done and doing the actual restoration, they'll put the crust back down. So it's recognized as a very important part of the ecology. So the bottom line is when we design these landscapes, we try to do it in a way that closely emulates California's native ecology, at least as much as we know how to. And, you know, we don't typically add soil amendments. We don't typically fertilize. I'm not a huge fan of drip, as Connie knows, although I'm lightening up a little bit on that. We've been playing with some of these netafin systems, and especially, you know, like when you're in real narrow planters, it's almost impossible to set them up for overhead irrigation. So we've been using some netafim, and I think we've been pretty successful with it. What I like about overhead is it's more like natural rainfall, and it comes down through the plants, through the leaves, through the mulch, you know, brings in some micronutrients, which are also part of that mycorrhizal ecology. And it just removes some variables from potential negative variables from very poorly understood chaotic systems. So, but I'm not quite as hardcore on that as I used to. I'm actually lightening up a little bit, Connie. So on design, this is really important. This is a factor I think it gets missed in a lot of native design, because it's really important to create a backbone of these landscapes. And you do that by using evergreen plants that have a lot of color and texture to them. So it looks good all year long. And you're getting a lot of that foundation, that backbone from these evergreen plants. And it's really helping to avoid, you know, that dormant appearance you can get in late summer, early fall. So evergreen plants tend to pretty much take care of that situation. And then your other 25% are these perennials that we're using along the edges. And, you know, they're giving us right up front color that's very easy to deadhead. And then we use perennials that bloom at different times of the year. So like when these daisies are blooming, the Zauschneria epilobium is still waiting. And then late in summer, this will start to bloom and bloom right into December. So by mixing the bloom cycles, we're getting color all year long. And then we have these colorful evergreens that are providing the backbone. And that's really how you achieve a native landscape that looks good all year long. Pretty straightforward. But it's important to put the color along the edges because it's easier to maintain a deadhead, and you just see that color right up front. You're dazzled by it. Of course, the styles we talk about in the first book, different styles, because literally any landscape style could be achieved with native plants, with a native plant palette. We have so many species and niches and varieties that there's really a native plant for every situation. And, you know, one that doesn't readily come to mind, certainly with natives, are formal gardens. And in the book, in this chapter, we actually show the rendering of the landscape. And then next to it, we actually have the design plan that shows the plants that are being used to achieve it. And in this case, you know, a lot of it is achieved through the hardscape. You know, it's actually more like a movie set. And so the props are very important. So in a formal garden, which can be, you know, looked at as a, you know, type popular in Europe, brought here, you know, that DG path, that curved central bench, the little pilasters, the reflecting pool, the statuary, you know, those all scream formal garden. And then the plant elements, for instance, the cypress or native cypress, like either Tecate or Gowans or pygmy cypress, they're wonderful for that. The little round balls with the pink flowers are actually Santa Cruz buckwheat. The box hedges are wonderfully achieved with either red berry or a beautiful little manzanita called green sphere. Green sphere is like the perfect substitute for boxwood hedges. Same size leaves, compact, round. I mean, they're just fantastic. So we're starting to use it. Musa is starting to grow it for us. We love it. So it's called green sphere. The lollipop trees that are evergreen, in this case, are actually Catalina cherries, which have leaves like ficus, but not the nasty roots, not the water requirement, and they have edible cherries. And say in the back there around that fountain, instead of ivy, we're actually growing Catalina evergreen perfume currant, which is a wonderful vine. It's also great under oak trees as a ground cover. So I will say that there is nothing low maintenance about this landscape. But, you know, if you've got to have your yard look at something like Versailles, you can actually do it with a native plant palette. Similarly, you can also do it with contemporary styles. Contemporary style can use a lot of the same plants, but it tends to be very rectilinear, very planal. The plants themselves are usually organized in linear patterns and are often very spiky. So you're using a lot of grasses and agaves and yuccas. But you can also introduce elements like the cypress. The green sphere manzanita would be wonderful for that as well. And then maybe specimen plants like in the back there where we have a Dr. Hurd manzanita. So again, I actually get a lot of requests for contemporary style landscapes, and we do have a few out there and they do just fine. And it's just a matter of knowing what plants to use and how to use them. Now, Mediterranean, that's probably kind of a slam dunk when you think of natives, because that's a less formal, more kind of a billowy design. You're using a lot of plant color and textures and maybe repeating patterns. But in this case, instead of having a bay tree in the back there as a specimen, well, it is a bay tree actually, it's a California bay tree. We actually have a native bay tree that smells and tastes exactly like European bay, Laurus nobilis, but in our case, our native bay is exactly twice as strong. So you simply use half as much. So instead of a full bay leaf, if you're using the native, you use a half. But to look at it, you could hardly tell the difference. It's Umbularia californica versus Laurus nobilis. And then underneath that bay tree, we've got a herd of coral bells, heuchera. And then on the trellises in back, we're training grapes on there, but we're using Rogers Red wild grape. The grapes are actually edible on that, but more importantly, the leaves turn brilliant burgundy and red in autumn. A stunning plant, like the red maples back east. It gives you wonderful fall color. It's just lovely, and it's great on trellises, and certainly lends that Mediterranean feel to the garden. And certainly our native cypress again, and things like you see the ceanothus closer to the front here with the blue flowers. But also look that we've included some dwarf citrus. Not native, but it likes the same mycorrhizae as a lot of our natives do. And they are highly ornamental in themselves. And, you know, of course, the fruit adds color in that. And edibles are kind of part of our overall philosophy too. So we like to include them. They just want a little bit more water, but they like the inorganic mulch in this case. And honestly, unless you're going to open up a fruit stand, I recommend dwarf citrus. So you'll never eat all the lemons and oranges that fall off these things otherwise. And also, again, the staging is very important for the Mediterranean look. The ornate fountain, the trellises, the tile work, the stepping stones with the diamond shaped tiles, you know, that's all part of that overall movie set of the Mediterranean garden. Now, on a completely different garden style, you have desert or Southwestern. And when I first started in this business, you know, everybody used to think when I would say that I do native landscaping, they immediately assume that I did cactus gardens. Well, it doesn't mean I don't love cactus, and we have some beautiful cactus, but they're not predominant in our plant communities. There's more of them out in the desert. They all form components of virtually all of our plant communities, but they don't dominate them. In fact, when I do a desert landscape or Southwestern, I do use some cactus and succulents, but the predominant plants are actually woody shrubs and trees. But the setup is completely different. First off, the shrubs are native. Well, Anza borrego is a great example. Anza borrego has amazing elements for a Southwestern landscaping, including things like ocotillo there, and the brittle bush, and the desert penstemons, and the apricot mallows, and the palo verdes, and the desert willows. Those are all native right here in Anza borrego. But notice how spaced out the plants are. They're very individually spaced because there's much less resources available to them. And so they need a wider area to access them. Also the mulch. Notice the mulch is not organic. It is inorganic and sand and rocks and gravel and pebbles and boulders. That really defines it as a Southwestern style landscape. Now in this little vignette here, we're using DG, decomposed granite, for both the mulch and for the pathway, but the pathway is a slightly different color DG, so it contrasts. And in one corner there, we have a very rustic ramada. And the triangle of trees includes two palo verdes, in this case, Desert Museum, which is probably the best palo verde to use in our gardens. It's very floriferous and it doesn't have spines. It's really nice. And then in back of it, I've got a beautiful desert willow. Desert willow is not a willow. It's actually in the trumpet vine family, and the flowers are like orchids. They're fragrant and very frilly, and they bloom from about April to October. So it's a great, easy, wonderful plant, fast growing, very drought tolerant, very heat tolerant, great in parking lots, for instance, and very colorful. I love to use desert willows, and I typically try to use varieties that don't have a lot of seeds, because the only unsightly part to desert willows, and it's unsightly is relative, but they do tend to hold a lot of seed pods on them when they lose their leaves in winter. But we've got one that we introduced. It's named after my assistant Maggie. It's called Maggie's Pink, and Musa is selling that, and it's a two-tone pink flower. It's not patented, so it's not very expensive. Some of the patented ones are also seedless, but very expensive, but beautiful, like Monhues or Timeless Beauty. Those are great. They have a dark magenta and white flower. Very striking, very large flowers, fairly seedless, but very expensive because they're patented. On the other side where the fire pit is, you know, we've again created this rustic feature with the boulders and the bench. And then around it, we're using a really beautiful small tree that I'm trying to popularize. It's called the desert olive, Forestiera pubescens, or Forestiera neomexicana. I think they're the same thing. But what's neat about them is they top out about 12 to 14 feet. They're multi-trunked. That brilliant white bark that just glows with night lighting when you uplight them. Very heat and drought tolerant. Often, if there's a bit of chill in the winter, when they go deciduous in winter, they will turn brilliant yellow, almost like a forsythia. I mean, just gorgeous, stunning plant. Incredibly easy, incredibly adaptable, fast growing, but tops out at a small size, perfect in courtyards. So that's the desert willow. I think I've got a picture of one later in the show here. All right, so that's your Southwestern desert. Very different zeitgeist than the other styles, but definitely achievable with 100% native palette and beautiful. And more of a kind of, you'd think of like a Palm Springs type look or a Las Vegas kind of look, but I get a lot of requests for them here as well. So then I said, okay, what style would really blow people's paradigms, you know, that you wouldn't think achievable with an all California native palette? And of course, that's a Japanese garden. But yes, I actually, when I did these designs, I actually had trouble narrowing down the number of species that were appropriate for my Japanese garden design. And certainly, again, it's all about staging, the fencing, the gate, the stepping stone path, the arched bridge, the lantern, the tea house, the deck, the water feature, the rocks. Even if there wasn't a plant in this place, you would know we were building a Japanese garden. There's no doubt about it. But then the plants are really fantastic. Like we have this Pacific Coast iris that not only has beautiful flowers, but it's also evergreen. Then instead of a gardenia, we use a California bush anemone, which is also fragrant, not quite as strong as a gardenia, but has these beautiful white flowers and evergreen leaves. We also have tons of native dogwoods. So this is our dogwood that comes from Palomar Mountain, Cornus nataliae, manzanitas of all different sizes and shapes. Certainly over here, you know, if you've ever tried using Japanese maple in Lakeside, it's a bit difficult. These things vaporize if you sneeze. They really need daily watering almost and nearly full shade to be able to grow inland. So what do we use? We actually use a miniature form of our native California box elder. It's also a maple. It has very delicate features, but looks can be deceiving because it's tough as nails. It is a really tough plant, can often have nice fall color. It has almost all the virtues of a Japanese maple, but it's much more heat and drought tolerant. And there's a miniature version called Birch Toy Box, which tops out about 15 to 20 feet. So it's even a nice scale. It's that one is not nearly as massive or greedy or needy as the ones that grow in the Midwest. Our California ones are a little better behaved. And then also, as far as the pine trees, you know, black maples, again, really need a lot of water and a lot of attention, but we have some really great substitutes. One is the shore pine, which is Pinus contorta contorta, perfect substitute for black pine. But there's also a native pine that grows along the coast. It's called bishop pine. Now, it typically occurs in Northern California. I mean, there's tons of them in Bodega Bay, for instance. And they're a fast-growing small pine that tops out about 30 feet. But here's what's really cool. There is a disjunct population of bishop pines growing in Baja. And these appear to be much more drought tolerant. In fact, in the location in Baja where they're growing, there's cactus growing all around the base of them. So they're heat tolerant, they appear to be very drought tolerant, but they still have the advantage of being that fast growing small pine. So we were able to obtain some seed and we're growing some to test them, and I've just installed them in my first landscape in Poway. So I'll let you know how it goes, but we're very excited about it because so far so good. They're doing great, and it looks like it might be very appropriate for here in San Diego and be able to take a fair amount of heat. And so we're excited about it, and it's the kind of a small pine that fits most residential landscapes. So yes, you can achieve it. If you don't happen to believe me, well, here's what we did in 2013. This was at the fair, and the San Diego County Fair, formerly Del Mar Fair. And our display was a Japanese garden with all California native plants. Notice these huge box manzanitas that we use. These were being grown by big trees at the time. They're actually being salvaged from construction sites in the wild. The beautiful native iris, our coffee berry, fantastic. I had sycamore in there, and I had some cottonwoods instead of poplars. And towards the front, we even had one of those little box elders substituting for a Japanese maple. The tea house, the bridge, the beautiful Asian style lanterns that were created by Laird Plumley out in Encinitas. They're just gorgeous things. And then the pièce de résistance was the bonsai that was on display inside the tea house, and that was actually a lemonade berry. So Phil Tactile, who's kind of the whose family are sort of the bonsai masters in San Diego County, had this beautiful bonsai lemonade berry. So literally every constituent in this display was native to California. There's a picture during the daylight from the back. I can't speak highly enough of Laird's beautiful lanterns. They have elements of the Asian Japanese style, but the motifs are like Torrey pines and native oaks, and they're constructed, here's one back in here, constructed of like teak and ceramic, and I mean, they're not inexpensive, but oh boy, are they ever gorgeous. And so also, we didn't want to really mess with a recirculating water feature, so instead we use that as an opportunity to create a Zen garden. And we even constructed our own little rake, and we would rake this thing to create the little grooves in there to give it the appearance of water. And there's another angle there with this sort of offset bridge and lighting leading into the tea house. And we did pretty well. I think we won like 9 awards with this, and we were very proud of it. And this was done with San Diego Botanic Garden, who had master craftsmen, carpenters, and I designed everything, and they brought it to fruition and with all their custom ability. It was just fantastic. This actually still exists, and ironically, they moved it to the bamboo garden over at the San Diego Botanic Garden. So site preparation now. Now we're getting into the nitty gritty. We kind of figured out what kind of style we want to use. And doing our site prep, you know, there's usually very little that we hang on to. Mature trees being an exception, but they need to be compatible mature trees. A lot of mature trees have very greedy root systems, so that can actually be kind of a problem. Native plants are not very competitive. They're actually mutualistic, and they're fairly benign. They don't compete with non-natives very well. So we usually clean up. We try to eliminate as much of the roots as possible. You know, if there's lawns, we're doing a lot of lawn replacements. We'll kill the lawn by whatever socially acceptable method you choose to use. We usually cut it out a couple inches below the surface because we get rid of all the salts and bacteria and pathogens and weeds and gunk. Maybe create a compost pile to pile up the old sod so it breaks down. You can use that for a vegetable garden. Then we'll remove any other features that you're not keeping, like walkways, landscape fabric. I usually get that out of there, gravel, whatever. Also, gnomes and pink flamingos. We definitely try to remove those, although I do have my price, so I can be negotiated with. But yeah, they don't generally stay in a native landscape, sorry. Then we'll set our rough grading in there, and then we'll install all our hardscape and flat work, rocks and paths, and then we'll do the irrigation. If you're laying down new flat work, you need to get underneath it. Just remember, and anybody that's thinking of having concrete work done, and you have isolated planters next to the house, say, do yourselves a huge favor and have the contractor put some 4-inch drain pipe as chasers underneath the concrete. And you can run all your infrastructure, all your piping, all your electrical, whatever, through those 4-inch drain pipes. You'll be thanking yourself later, and they never do it. They almost never do it. You have to ask them to do it. And it can leave you a real disaster, because if they isolate a planter with nothing but concrete surrounding it, how are you going to get all your piping and everything into there? So remember to have them put down sleeves. And then typically our irrigation tends to be overhead. This is an MP rotator system on a 12-inch pop-up. And this is a swing joint right here with a piece of funny pipe in there. And this allows movement. It separates any forces from the PVC here. That's really how it should be done these days. The 12-inch pop-ups are great. The ones we use have built-in pressure regulators for our nozzles, which are optimized for 40 PSI. And being so long, they completely disappear into the mulch basically, and then when it's time to water, they come way up and above all the ground covers and shrubs, water, and then whoop, go right back down and disappear. Okay, if you have an existing drip system, it's very easy to convert to microsprays. And like I say, we've been having some success using like the Netafim type grid type systems, which are the hoses with little emitters in them, and they're set on a grid pattern. And here are some of the features. This is how we like to do decomposed granite pathways. This is, we typically don't use edging anymore. We just like to kind of dome them in the middle and feather them out to the edges, and then run the mulch up to the edge. And that's it. It creates very durable pathways, last for years and years, very low maintenance, almost no maintenance. The decomposed granite we use has a binder mixed in with it. So it's wet compacted, usually with a vibroplate machine. And when it hardens, when it dries, it's almost like concrete. It's very clean and hard and very durable, but still permeable, interestingly enough. We do a lot of flagstone work. This is out in El Cajon. This is a new entryway that we did. We do a lot of stairways. This is how we like to do our timber steps with pressure treated wood and rebar and bolts. And they too are, again, very durable. And this was a very, very steep landscape on the side of a hill in Corona del Mar. Interestingly, houses all around this site were slipping down into the canyons. Very unstable soil there. And one of the aspects that's great about natives is their mycorrhizal fungi that permeates the soil can be very soil stabilizing. Also, you can use metal risers to create steep steps. This is going up a bluff in downtown San Diego. These are metal risers. These are actually concrete steps because we had to really just scrunch in a lot of verticality in a short space. And these are the plants on there. These are the retaining walls we put in. And here's how it looked about a year later. And this is a good example, by the way, of how you can landscape a very steep coastal bluff. Okay, and this is a bush poppy and ceanothus yerba buena, and notice how we used, I like to drape wild grape and morning glories to kind of at the top and grow down these steep embankments, and you can see how it grew up onto the wires of the stairway here on the railing and made a really nice effect. So it is possible to landscape something this vertical. And boy, when you get this kind of growth in there, the erosion pretty much comes to nothing. We do a lot of rock work. We're kind of known for our rock work, and we usually work with very serious sized boulders. This is another view of that one we did in Corona del Mar, the pathway coming down and across, and the large boulders were there, and then we added a lot of the smaller boulders and the ones at the bottom here. So we try to make our boulder rock work as realistic as possible and functional. But yeah, these are very unstable soils, very unstable slopes there in Corona del Mar, and the natives really go a long way towards helping to stabilize them. We're also known for our dry streams or bioswells. That's kind of the new term. Again, we'd use a mix of rocks in different positions, create a lot of meander. These things eat rock. A cubic yard does about 1 to 2 foot of stream. Okay, so an 80-foot stream could have 40 cubic yards of boulders. All right, so, and that's if you're doing it right, because we try to make them look as natural, like they've been there the whole time. That's the greatest compliment we ever get. People ask us, "Oh, was that there before you did the landscape?" So we do rock walls. When we mortar them, we try to, if we're doing a dry stack look, if it's actually mortared with a core and reinforced rebar, but when we do the mortaring, we do it recessed and back in, sunken back a few inches, so the rocks look like they're just dry stacked there. But this is actually a very strong, effective retaining wall. Or this is another system we'll use. We'll use pressure treated lumber. This is like 4x12s, and we will sink I-beams. In this case, we sunk them in about 6 feet into cement, and then the above ground portion served as channels in which we set the 4x12 pressure treated lumber. Very strong, very effective, nice and rustic looking, and very long lasting. Or you can do retaining walls with different types of dry stack systems, and you can use pavers too for creating the paving. So we do a lot of that kind of work too. So, once you've done your hardscape and your rock work and everything, put your irrigation in, it's time to do planting. And typically, especially with natives, we're using 1 to 5 gallon plants. That's usually what's available. Most native plants tend to grow rather fast when they're young. Some of these sages will grow close to 1 foot a month. And you end up with much healthier, better established plants, and it's a lot less expensive. And you just, need to lay it out spacing for final size to let these things grow in. And a lot of times people are frustrated with me because they see a bunch of little green tufts in a sea of mulch. But I tell them, well, don't worry. I'm here to hold your hand. Call me in 3 months. And sure enough, I'll get a call. I can't believe how these things have grown. So they get over it pretty quick. And then, planting natives, it's a little different than your typical ornamentals. But I think you can understand the concept. That's basically to dig a hole and stick them in. We don't use fertilizer amendment in most cases. Their ecology is set up for a lack of soil nutrition and a lack of organic matter in the soil. We want to try to encourage that. And actually, the plants become the most mycorrhizal and symbiotic under slight stress. So much better off not to kill them with kindness. And by adding fertilizer and amendments, you can kind of shift the ecology overnight from being a real clean fungal-based ecology to a bacterial-based ecology very quickly. And I do like to make the holes a little shallow so that the top of the root ball in the pot, the top of the root ball in the pot is above the surrounding soil by a ½ inch to an inch, and that's for future settling and drainage. Very important not to end up with a plant in the bottom of the hole. You can create a temporary basin to hold water, knowing, especially on slopes, you got to do it on slopes, knowing that, in a few months when things start to get really established, you take your finger and kind of break the little berm that's holding the water so it can drain. And that's 6 months or so in. And also, if you have 6 to 12-inch boulders available, we'll put them right on the roots. I mean, not a campfire ring, I mean right on the root ball, with just enough space for the plant to grow through. And they love that. And it really protects the plants and keeps the moisture in and looks kind of cool. And then the most important step afterwards is to water, water, water. I mean, 1 to 5 gallons that day in clay soil, maybe 5 to as much as 30 gallons in well-draining soil per plant that day. And that is to settle the soil around the root ball and remove any air pockets. It's very important. And people often underwater natives when they first put them in. We find it's an essential step to just try to float them right back out of the hole. That's how much water we'll put on that first day. And then we may use something called pre-emergent, which kills seed in the soil, because you can have a huge seed bank in there, 10,000, 100,000 seeds per cubic foot. And it won't harm the growing plants, but it will help control the seedlings from coming up in that seed bank. Now, after the pre-emergent, we'll put down our mulch. Our organic mulch is typically shredded redwood bark. It lasts for years, and it's the most like the duff layer, the natural duff layer, and it kind of knits up and compacts down, and it's great for steep slopes. It holds its color. It's really good stuff. You can see this here in front of a slope that was mulched a couple of years before, and the mulch is just like carpeting on there. So it's really good stuff. And then if we're doing a desert Southwestern garden, we're using sand, rocks, and pebbles. And virtually any type of native, no matter what mulch group it comes from, likes having those 6 to 12-inch boulders put on the root ball. So when we water, this is what an MP rotator looks like in action. They act like summer thunderstorms or fog drip. They only put down about a 0.39 inches of precipitation an hour. Very slow, just they love it. You gotta water more frequently, of course, when you put in a new landscape, especially in summertime. These heat waves are deadly. We've had this last summer was really awful. Because we have these heat waves. I think we went about 5 or 6 weeks without having a single day drop below 90 degrees. And some of those days had almost no humidity. And it was just endless and relentless and nothing like anything we've encountered. And the problem is that a lot of these plants actually come from more northern regions of California, and they're used to a little bit more water and a little bit more humidity and a little cooler conditions. So we emulate that. And one of the things that we do is, instead of watering, let's say for 40 minutes, 40 minutes every 8 days, we'll water every other day for maybe 10 minutes. It's the same amount of water. We're just putting putting it down for shorter run times, but more frequently. And what that does is help cool the plants off, and it wets the mulch, but it doesn't really saturate the soil. And so you get a little bit of evaporative cooling, and the plants really seem to dig it. It really helps them get through some of these nasty heat waves, especially the ground covers, the low growing ground covers that are getting a lot of reflected heat off the ground. This kind of more frequent, shorter runtime thing to get you through those heat waves, it's been working wonders for us. Now, maintenance, you know, if they're evergreen plants like manzanita or ceanothus or coffeeberry, they really require virtually no pruning, especially if you've spaced them out for their final size. Perennials, though, and sages do require, to look their best, removal of the dead flowers, which you know is deadheading. That's why we try to limit it to about 25% of the planting and 75% being evergreen, because that keeps it lower maintenance. And then other type trimming type things, operations, shaping, removal of dead branches and thinning, maybe to accent the scaffolding of manzanita or whatever, or other pruning functions. But many of you who've been to my talks are aware of this problem here. You know, especially as things have started to really heat up over the years here, we've seen our mortality rates start to creep up. Back in the 90s, back up till about the mid 2000s, we had incredible mortality rates, usually less than 5%. But then we noticed that the weather, the summers were getting hotter and the heat waves were longer, and that some of our, especially our late summer mortality was starting to creep up. And, you know, natives to begin with had this reputation for being either short-lived, like ceanothus, or difficult, or just dying, and people left scratching their heads, wondering what they were doing wrong. And as we researched it, we discovered that most people were doing nothing wrong. It wasn't their fault. It was actually the fault of Argentine ants. And it turns out that they may be the single greatest threat in suburban native landscapes. I'm not talking so much out in the wild where you're away from moisture sources. I'm talking within 200 to 300 yards of a moisture source, which still is a lot. And in fact, a lot of people that have almost unirrigated native landscapes still have natives on both sides with lawns and pets. And so the ants are coming in from their properties and nesting in the root balls of the native plants. So what they'll do is they'll remove soil, and by removing soil, they destabilize the plant. The plants often feel really loose in the soil. And then, like in this picture, they'll actually place sucking insects. This is scale completely covering the root on this Lavatera. That's not rough bark, that is scale, and it is completely covering it. But unfortunately, it's down below ground where you don't see what's going on. And so they start killing these plants from below ground because they're all placed on the roots, and they're protected with their lives. And they also spread diseases through this process by directly inoculating them in the roots. The ants are like little typhoid Marys. They plant weeds like crazy. They eat the attachment points of weed seeds and then drop the seed. And right outside their nest usually, and you end up with these weeds coming out of the middle of a well-foliated, dense plant and not out in the open areas surrounding it. And that tells you there's an ant nest in there. And also the weeds will pop up along their trails too. And, you know, we've come up with strategies, which I'll talk about, to control the overall colonies. But if you have a dying plant, you need active intervention. Here's a ceanothus root. Again, the ceanothus are not naturally short-lived. They lived over 100 years in the wild. But in our gardens, because of the ant situation that everybody, literally everybody has, unless you live out in the desert, even the deserts have them. I mean, they're almost inescapable. They come in, and this is a ceanothus root, and all those little bumps there are actually scale. And they so dehydrated this thing that the root and the lower branches started cracking and shrinking. Okay, it's terrible. But again, most of this is not seen, it's not obvious. And so people are wondering what's wrong with these plants, or why is ceanothus so short-lived? Or did I fertilize too much, or did I water too much, or not enough water? It's none of the above. It's the friggin' ants, excuse my French. And so the dehydration has cracked it and killed it. And then the pathogens come in. And so this is an example of how they plant weeds. You know, if you have these sudden bursts of invasive species where there's nothing before, look more closely, because quite often it's ants that brought them in. And we're not, you know, people know about the relationship between ants and spurge, right? Well, that's one of dozens of species that they love to plant. And this is classic right here. This is one of their favorite weeds to plant. This is African veldtgrass, Ehrharta. And it's not coincidental that it's coming out of the base of a dead sage. There's also Oxalis corniculata, which is one of their favorite ones. There's also Scarlet Pimpernel right here, which is one of their favorites. And remember, before it died, this was densely, completely covered soil. The sage was densely foliated, and yet all these weeds came up underneath it and not around it. And it's all evidence of the ant infestation. So, and them coming out, this is classic, coming right out of the base, and that tells you there was a ant nest in there. Yeah, not randomly distributed. Here, this mallow right here was killed by the ants. How do you tell? Well, look at all the spurge all around it. They came in. When I grabbed this mallow, it just came right out of the soil. There was nothing holding it left because the ants had removed all the soil around the roots, creating the nest. Okay, that's why you will see these weeds completely surrounding these these native plants that have died and are loose in the soil. And they can also take over wetlands and vernal pools and coastal marshes. So here's some of their favorite weeds. This is brass buttons. You see this with them all the time. Here you see the veldtgrass coming out of this very rare copperleaf that fortunately I got under control, and it's still alive. It's almost 20 years old. But this is how I almost lost it. Again, here's other examples of Ehrharta coming up around dead plants that the ants had planted. The Baccharis is starting to kill the Baccharis right here, coming up at the base. Killed this sage, killed this Ian bush. I actually had this manzanita was in my book, and then about a year later, they came in and killed it. And there's their parting gift, all this African veldtgrass around the base. So it's a very common, repeatable, easily identifiable phenomenon. There's your Scarlet Pimpernel that they love. They plant purslane like crazy. So you'll see a lot of purslane, and that's associated with ants quite frequently. Chickweed, a lot of chickweed being planted by ants. This fireweed. So the fireweed is interesting because by the way, you'll see a lot of these same weeds coming up in pots, in potted plants, and in nursery plants. And the reason is that the ants get into that root ball, and that is very light, airy soil. They love to nest in there. And they're putting scale, they're putting aphids all over those roots. And a lot of times you plant that plant and you just transfer that whole ant colony right into your garden, right there, ready to go. They plant horseweed. This is you'd think it's so big, but the seed is relatively small. And I see a lot of this associated with ants. And this is that small oxalis, the seed type oxalis, not the sour grass, the little one. See this all the time in pots and in our gardens, and it's being planted by ants like crazy. They plant Mexican feather grass. I've seen perfect correlations between ant trails and ant nests and feather grass. And you know how invasive this stuff is. In fact, I wish they didn't even sell it in San Diego County. I wish they used natives like our native purple threon, which is a perfect substitute, but not quite as invasive. This stuff is nuts, and a lot of it's being done because of the ants spreading it all over the place. They like to plant sow thistle, dandelion. Even somehow, I don't know how they're planting cheeseweed, but we've seen a real close association with ant infestations as well. So what's the treatment strategy? To target the queens instead of the workers. These queens, well, the workers only live about 40 days, but the queens can live upwards of 15 years. And each queen can pump out up to 800 babies a month. 800 babies a month. And there can be 8 queens for every 1,000 workers. And a typical home can have close to 1 million workers. Okay, so those are the kinds of numbers. And these are super colonies, so they're not territorial. They just keep coming in and coming in. So to control the ants overall, we're using these dilute bait systems that allow the bait to be taken into the nest to kill a queen that might be 3 feet down, pumping out babies. This is my favorite right here, the Adbion. This is a peanut butter based bait station, and then this is more sugar based, and I'll squirt a little bit of this gel into this bait station to make it irresistible, because they like both protein and sugar. And so this is a dual thing with the peanut butter, and then I add a little bit of sugar with this stuff, and the same active ingredient, and it works very slowly. So you don't really want to kill workers. You want them working for you, and they want to be killing the queens. And this is another strategy, this gourmet liquid ant bait, which we usually cut 50-50 with distilled water. Don't use city water. They don't like chlorine, so use the distilled water. And we use these stations, and we set them up about every 50 feet in shade. So these are really good, especially for you only need a few of them in your yard. And I don't put them right on the ant trail. I can actually set them off away, and the scouts will find them. And so this is a good large scale strategy, especially. But then, if you've got, so here's a classic case of a dying plant that's infested with ants that have also brought in pathogens, okay? And the only way, you're not gonna save this using bait stations. You gotta actually actively intervene. So through a lot of years of research and development, I came up with a concoction that is 3 components. It's not systemic. So when you apply it to the root system, it doesn't get carried up into the plant and kill pollinators. And it's usually a combination root soak and trunk spray. You can even spray the whole plant if needed, but you do not spray flowers. Whatever you do not spray flowers. You don't want to kill pollinators with butterflies. And it's a mixture of pyrethrin or synthetic pyrethroid like bifenthrin. I prefer the pyrethroids. They're not technically organic. They're based on organic pyrethrin, but they last 3 months versus 1 to 2 days with pyrethrin. The pyrethrin is incredibly pH sensitive. Anything over 7.2, it starts to degrade. Our water is 8.5. The synthetic pyrethroid could care less, and it lasts, like I say, 3 months. I'll mix in neem oil, which is organic and is a great fungicide, miticide, so it helps with diseases. And I'll mix in Super Thrive to help stimulate the damaged roots to start growing again. So it's a 3-way concoction. We've got a copy of my write-up, the paper, on the Native Plant Society website, or if you email me, I'd be happy to respond with a copy of my write-up, and I can even give you some of these before and after pictures. So this is a Lionothamnus, the Catalina iron or Santa Cruz Island ironwood. They have a reputation for being very difficult in a lot of landscapes. And here's the before picture, and here it is afterwards, less than 6 months later. So here's the before, same tree after. Okay, I mean, we're seeing astounding recoveries in these plants. Just almost miraculous. Here, flannel bush. This has a reputation for being one of the most difficult native plants. They aren't difficult at all. They grow like monsters, but being a mallow, the ants seem to have a special affinity to mallows, marshmallows, I guess, mallows and ceanothus. Okay, and so here's a dying flannel bush. It's infested with ants and pathogens. And here's that same flannel bush 9 months later. Okay, I mean, it's profound, the differences, the recoveries that we're seeing in about 75% of the cases. I mean, it's a significant proportion, and it's very gratifying, okay? Because if you could take a ceanothus that looks like this, where most people are making their peace with it, and bring it back to this, you know, you've kind of achieved something, all right? And it's working, and it's repeatable. It's been fantastic, and my native plants don't die anymore. And so as long as we jump on it while it still has some life left in it, and this is very typical of a late summer failing ceanothus. The leaves are curling, turning yellow. They're not even falling off. They're being held on the plant. That's from the pathogens and the appropriation of moisture and sugars in the root ball. Then we put on the root soak, and here it is the following spring. And we need to repeat the application about once every 3 months from about March to October. But it doesn't take that long. We use a hose end applicator, and my God, I mean, and they kill non-natives too. They're just responsible for most of the death we're seeing in these landscapes in general, whether it's native or not. Oh, here's a ribes, okay, before, after. Pink flowering currants can sometimes be a little finicky. Well, it's not the plant, it's the fact that the ants get in there and attack them. Other types of maintenance, pest control. Gophers and squirrels, most of us have encountered these buggers. They can destroy an entire landscape. I'm not a big fan of using cages because it can truncate the root system and that. Better than nothing, but I like to use traps like black hole traps. And of course, I used to have the ultimate gopher kitty, old Charlie. Unfortunately, Charlie passed away a couple of years ago, but he was an incredible companion, and boy, what a gopher kitty. There, he get 4 gophers to every 2 I'd catch. And of course, since we lost Charlie, we've got a couple new babies. That's Duncan and Winchell. Well, they're no longer kittens anymore. They're big boys, but they're so cute in this picture, I just couldn't resist. Weeds. So weeds are not natives, okay? By definition, weeds are not native plants. It's not just a plant growing where it's not wanted. A weed is usually non-native, highly invasive, and adept at shutting down our delicate native ecology and taking over. And mustard is one of the worst because it actively targets our mycorrhizal fungi and destroys it by secreting cyanide into the soil. So that's why you'll see these lovely fields of mustard and nothing else. They've literally killed everything else. You can see they're in this picture, they're killing these trees in this photo. So mustard is not at all good stuff. Very, very nasty. In fact, we have a mustard that is in many of our landscapes that's doing the same thing. If you've ever worked with sweet alyssum, that's just a white, fragrant, pretty mustard. And that's why they'll take over the landscape after the 2nd or 3rd year. They've killed everything else that can't tolerate it. And it can, you know, when you get the weeds under control, the consequences can be pretty profound. Like these 2 Engelmann oak trees. This This one on the left is how all the Engelmans looked on our property here. And then we got to work in about 18 months, pretty much got all the weeds under control and angled the 40 mature Engelmann rare and endangered oaks on this property, rewarded us by going into bright yellow bloom, which they were the only Engelmann oaks in this whole valley that went into bloom. 10 acres you could have seen from a satellite. And of course, if you have blooms, that leads to acorns, and acorns lead to more oak trees or squirrels. We're usually trying to use the least mechanically invasive methodology, because when you pull weeds, the compaction, the disturbance, it just brings up more weeds. So often we're very judiciously using herbicides and pre-emergence to help control the seed in the soil. Okay, and the final thing, and the final area we're going to cover is plant selection, what plants to use in these landscapes. So I've kind of gone over the basic methodology, some of the challenges we have, maintenance. And in our second book, we actually are using icons to describe drainage. So that's the icon for requiring a plant that requires excellent drainage, moderate drainage, or will tolerate poor drainage. Soil preference, you can either grow best in clay or sand, or sand. Its frost tolerance, which basically is a snowflake. It indicates if it's frost hardy or not. What kind of exposure it likes, whether it likes full sun, part shade, or full shade. And then finally, this is really unique to this book and was probably the most difficult one to come up with, and that is how do you show what mulch the plant prefers? How do you illustrate in an icon mulch type? Well, the art department at Timber Press did a really good job, because there's their symbol for organic mulch, and there's their symbol for inorganic mulch. And you look at that, you think, yeah, I can see that. I see what that's telling me. And there's even a symbol for plants that, like sycamores, that like, boulders and rocks around their base, and then like organic mulches outboard of that, which they form themselves with their heavy leaf drop in fall. So that's the symbology for the mulch. And here it is in action, okay? So here's one of these California box elders. They're beautiful trees. The toy box elder, Burt's toy box elder, is actually a miniature version of this, which is what I like to use for the Japanese maple. And like here are the different icons. It tolerates poor drainage. It can do well in clay or sand. It has frost tolerant. It probably does best in part shade, and it likes organic mulch. So I won't keep repeating that throughout, but that's what those mean, okay? Sycamores, really fast growing, wonderful trees. And no, they don't have to be sick evermore. That happens is they get attacked by anthracnose, and they'll drop their first flush of leaves in spring. And it is treatable. If you could get up high enough, you could do a dormant oil spray like you do for peach leaf curl. But what I do is a basil bark treatment with phosphorus acid. I use a surfactant that penetrates the bark penetrant. And I put on phosphorus acid in fall before they drop their leaves, and in spring before the leaves come out. And it's controlling the anthracnose nicely. So it's really nice not to have that constant drop of leaves that is unfortunately associated, because, when they brought over the English sycamores, they brought anthracnose with them. There's this beautiful ironwood I was telling you about, really fast growing, lovely evergreen tree that looks almost prehistoric. Well, it is. It's 50, 60 million years old. It used to cover the Western United States. Now it only grows, this particular form only grows on Santa Cruz Island. But it likes good drainage, clay or sand tolerant. It has some frost tolerance, probably does best in part shade, and it likes organic mulch. This is a oak tree I'd love to popularize. Hard to find right now, but it's the island oak. Our fastest growing oak, this thing can grow 6 feet a year. It is evergreen. It has the most immense prehistoric leaves and acorns. Look at the size of that acorn. That's my hand, guys. All right. These things are fantastic. And notice how narrow it is. It can grow tall and narrow, which means you can use it in surprisingly narrow spaces and smaller yards. And the roots are not at all nasty or invasive. It's just fantastic in all the ways. The leaves are huge and luscious, and the new growth is dark bronze. I can't say enough about this tree, and I'm just hoping they'll start growing more. There's a beautiful desert museum for you. And the fact that it doesn't have spines, it's actually like a three-way cross of two of our local species and the Mexican Palo Verde. So it's a wonderful tree, very floriferous, very easy, adaptable. And here's that beautiful desert olive with the white bark. And this one's going into its fall color, which is just lovely. I mean, this is a very Southwestern style landscape. And I just can't say enough about this tree, guys. It is just gorgeous and is so neat and clean. Most of the cultivars sold are actually male clones, so they don't even get berries, and they're just completely non-messy. But I actually get requests for one called Berry Girl because people want the little olives because the birds love them. Supposedly they're actually edible too, but anyway, the birds usually strip them. So, you know, if you don't have it next to a pavement, you can use the one with the pretty blue berries on it, and the birds love it. Of course, Ceanothus, right? Well, this is your Ceanothus, guys. This is Lakeside Ceanothus. This comes from El Capitan Park. All right. And do any of you guys know Ingrid Coffin? She's got Blue Sky Ranch there. Yeah, you know Ingrid, Connie. She had no idea that on her ranch there, she had 3/4 of the world's population of Ceanothus cyaneus growing. In fact, her husband was knocking him down and tearing him out. Thank God I got to her before he did too much damage. And look at the flowers on this thing. It's like an upside down wisteria. I mean, these inflorescences, some of them are a foot long, and it blooms late. It can bloom into June. And it's fast growing, it's big, glossy green leaves, and a true San Diego, true lakeside native, heat tolerant, fast growing tree form, small evergreen tree form of Ceanothus. You guys can be proud. So there you go. I love this plant. And that plant can probably grow 6 to 8 feet a year. Okay, so it's a rocket ship. Now, for those, this is not a ficus. It looks just like a ficus, but in fact, it's a Catalina cherry. And it has very benign root systems. It's drought tolerant, but it has evergreen ficus-like leaves, and it has edible cherries. Yes, the meat is kind of thin on there. The pits are huge, but when they're fully ripe, they taste like a Bing cherry. You just kind of scrape it off in your mouth. And then the indigenous people would grind up the pits and make the most wonderful, delicious cherry marzipan you ever had. Okay, and so, and in fact, in some tribes, like the up in Ventura County, not Cachuma, the Chumash, the pits of the cherries were actually more important than acorns. You just have to do the little bit of leaching process to remove the cyanide, like any of these stone fruits. But oh my God, it's delicious. And they would make wine from the meat of the cherries. These guys live great. This was great living out here. I'll tell you, it was paradise. Julia Phelps is a nice screening shrub. I'd say medium to large, about 6 to 8 feet. And most years so covered in flower, you don't even see the leaves. So Julia Phelps, very similar to Dark Star. I find Julia Phelps to be a little easier. We used to call Dark Star Death Star But actually, in reality, we think all along it's just ants. Ants are the problem. This is a gorgeous local native plant. In fact, this picture is taken in the chaparral of Encinitas at Lux Institute. This right here is Comorostaphylos, the summer holly. Very rare plant, closely related to manzanita. Look at the flowers on that. It is just a joy to behold. And smooth leaves, kind of shaggy bark on this one. Closely related to manzanita, but not a manzanita. Not a barn burner, grows a foot or two a year, but then as it gets larger, it starts growing faster. So gorgeous, gorgeous, wonderful, easy, small tree or large screening shrub. Of course, the flannel bush. It is safe to grow flannel bushes, guys. You don't need to be afraid of them. Just got to stay on top of the ants, that's all. They do prefer better drainage, okay? But a lot of times, if you want to cheat a little bit, you can actually create a bit of a raised bed or a mound and plant on top of that. Because where these grow, they actually grow pretty close to streams naturally. They'll grow in kind of granitic, sort of gravelly soil where they can get the tips of their roots down into the water table. And they're usually pretty inundated with water during the winter time. And I've had these things tolerate a sprinkler being left on for 3 days straight, okay? So the problem is that in the absence of knowing what the true cause is, people try to ascertain what killed it and they assumed it was overwatering. No, typically when you water a lot, that brings in the ants. And then the ants attack the roots and start killing it from below. And worse, they bring in the pathogens, and it's the pathogens that usually I think that nuke these things and finish them off. They get weakened by the sucking insects, and the pathogens kill them. But flannel bush is a piece of cake for us now. Talk about now getting, this is medium shrub. This is a beautiful manzanita called Paradise. Talk about getting color from foliage, okay? This is what it's about, you know? These things look like they're in bloom, but in fact, it's the foliage that's so brilliant red. Kind of have something in common with proteas that way. The bush poppy. Again, another plant that had an undeserved reputation for being a little difficult. Again, get the ants under control, no problems. These things bloom almost all year long. Sulfur yellow flowers, orange stamens, blue leaves, and covered in flowers. Just lovely. Very prized plant that is difficult to propagate, so you don't see as many of them out there as people would like. For the medium shrubs, love Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. Look at that. That's not trimmed or anything. That's just how they grow. They're that neat. And the flower heads fade at different times and get different colors. And then ground covers. One of the things I'm desperate for are local evergreen ground covers. Most of the ground covers that are evergreen come from up north, like Yankee Point, like Point Sal, Carmel Sur. I mean, all these coastal plants come from up north, and they've adapted to growing lower. And well, I found this growing in Rancho Santa Fe. This is a ground cover version of our rare and endangered Del Mar manzanita. Unfortunately, so Moosa Creek was growing these for me, and they'd gotten mixed up with the regular one. So we went through a very painstaking process to separate out the ground covers from the bushes, got that done. We're propagating the ground covers, we're getting some numbers up. And somebody walked into Moosa Creek Nursery and for some reason told them that they weren't Del Mar manzanita. And Moosa didn't want to risk selling a plant that they thought was misidentified, which it wasn't. I don't think they realized that I was the one who actually collected this plant on my stomach on a bluff. And unfortunately, they sold off all the ones they had for $1. And I happened to catch them. So they gave me a couple. So I'm growing them out again, and we're going to try to reintroduce them again. So, but yeah, we need more of these local ground cover evergreen species. I tell people, if you're out hiking and you see a low growing manzanita, low growing ceanothus in San Diego County, just note the coordinates on your phone and email me. I'll go out there and check it out, see if I can get permission to take cuttings, because I've got all the other aspects, all the other sizes covered. I just don't have many ground covers. Speaking of ground cover manzanita, this is Carmel Sur. Again, it's from up north, but what a beauty. This thing is just a gorgeous ground cover, you know? Why use Myoporum when you have stuff like this? You know, it's nice and stable and easy. Oh my gosh. Beautiful, beautiful ground covers with little flowers and even red berries. This is my favorite on slopes, this Bacchus Pigeon Point. It's an incredible slope stabilizer, very bright green, evergreen color. Pigeon Point's my favorite. I like it much better than Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks 2 might be okay. The original Twin Peaks is pretty yucky. I love Pigeon Point though. And it's very tough. I water it on a hot exposed slope. I would water it about once a week in Lakeside. But still, that's drought tolerant compared to most everything else growing on the slopes in Lakeside. Great slope. Here's a miniature form of basically Yankee Point. It's a prostrate blue blossom. It's actually growing with a little bit of Carmel Sur mixed in. Very low growing, very small scale. Yankee Points can get huge, like 20 feet across. This thing's more like 6 to 8 feet, so much better scaling. And then finally, our perennials that go along the edges. Of course, there's California fuchsia. It is the favorite of hummingbirds in summer, fall, no doubt. I love seaside daisies. One of my favorite forms is called WR. The flowers just glow and it's very neat and compact. But this is more the straight species, which is fine too. They tolerate clay really well. In Lakeside, you probably want to give it some afternoon shade. That's all. Penstemon Margarita Bop, what a plant. What a name. Love this plant. It really blooms like this, okay? Again, though, these mounting perennials can be susceptible to mealy scale brought in by our buddies, the ants. And so when they do fail, you tend to see them die from the center out. And that's because of the scale infestation in the center of the plant. But they respond beautifully to treatment and will grow right out of it in a matter of weeks. So this is Foothill Penstemon Margarita Bop. And you can see how we've used all these color spots right along the edge near this flagpole in this case. And it creates the sense of immense color while at the same time you've confined your maintenance to a relatively small area. And that, guys, is the end. So thank you very much. Kitty, do you want to take some questions? Or
actually, we have some questions here in the chat.
Okay.
From Leslie, who has a beautiful native garden, and she's asked, what recommendation do you have for natives around a pool with full sunshine and reflective heat from a block wall?
Plastic? No, just kidding. So the deal with pool plantings is they need to be able to tolerate splashing as much as anything. So you get that nasty chlorine water on things. Typically, what I'm using around pools are sedges and spike rushes. I've found the seaside daisy to be fairly tolerant of that exposure. You can use sages. The only issue with sages is that they do tend to attract bees. Now, when bees are foraging, they tend to be very docile. I've only gotten stung 3 times in my entire life. And it was always by bees protecting a hive. When they're on foraging flowers and that, I mean, they don't even look up. You could cup your hand around them, they won't care. They tend to be very docile. So I personally don't have much problem using sages in planters around pools. But just be aware that they do at least attract bees. What else? Some of the desert plants, believe it or not, work, like the apricot mallow. You could, it works with the hot exposure. I probably wouldn't put it right next to the pool, but if you've got planters near the pool and a hot exposure, you could use things like apricot mallow. You could use things like Apache plume, because you're just dealing with that hot exposure and reflected heat. Right around the pool, though, I'm generally using spike rushes and not Juncus acutus, because that'll stab you. I things like Juncus effusus, which is soft, or some of our native Carex species, which are lovely too. And they have a wide range of tolerance as far as the pool water.
And Leslie's other question, and mine as well, is that she hasn't had any luck growing the lakeside lilac, the ceanothus. Do you have any suggestions for ceanothus?
Well, so I probably need more information as to what the circumstances of their collapse was. Did they start out okay for a year or two and then collapse? Did they just die immediately after planting? Do you know? Like in your case, Kitty, what happened?
In my case, I was trying to grow them from cuttings and got nowhere. So.
Oh, okay. Well, propagation. They are surprisingly challenging. But I know that Moosa Creek grows them, and you can order through their website. You can order them when they have them in stock. Was that Leslie's question? Was she trying to propagate them, or is she trying to grow
She
them?
just said she hadn't had any luck growing them. Me, I tried to propagate them and had no luck.
So when I grow ceanothus, so remember that it's from Lakeside. So it's one of the species that should be able to handle almost no water in summer after it's established. So they grow naturally in El Capitan Park. There's another population in northern Baja someplace, but that's it. I mean, they're incredibly, over on Crest, they grow there. So they grow right around that area. And
So what are your tips for getting them established?
Right, so just like any other native plant, you water them in real good when you plant them. I like to put 6 to 12-inch rocks right on their roots. And the first year or two, I watered them about once a week during the summer months. But what I like to do, instead of like deep soaking them, is more water the upper levels of the soil and spritz the plant itself real good to kind of cool it off. And once it gets established, it can pretty much naturalize in Lakeside. I still would go out there though and dust them off, a couple times a month with a hose. They love that. And even if you get the upper layers of soil wet, it's not going to really hurt them. You just don't want to, I think, do in warm soil conditions, you don't want to do like a deep soak type watering. Other than that, they should be fine. But again, the culprit almost always is the ants moving in and attacking with the root scale, aphids, and pathogens. And that's usually what does them in.
This is Leslie. Part of my problem were the bunny rabbits. So after I put cages around them, they still didn't do well, but I think they may have been in too much shade, and maybe I'll try it again in a sunnier location.
Well, I mean, they can tolerate, they can grow in north slopes, so they can tolerate some afternoon shade. Ceanothus in general do very well in shade typically. But again, be aware of the ant situation. See if there's any Argentine ants headed for the roots. It can be very subtle. They can also enter in a number of feet away from the root ball, and you don't realize that they're right into it. And what you can do, if you're starting to have issues, you can kind of pull the mulch back and the dirt back from the base and see if they come welling up in a defense response. A lot of times they just come boiling out of the ground. And then you can give it my root soak, and that'll kill them and all the scale and the diseases almost instantly. And they'll often recover from a very stressed condition, you know, if you kind of jump on it. But that's typically, I mean, for me, it's almost a problem because ceanothus don't die anymore. And so I have babies coming up everywhere. And now I have a ceanothus jungle in my yard because I can't bear to rip them out, you know. But I get some pretty happy accidents too. Some neat ones that have hybridized and come up.
Oh, and another question I've had from several people is, do you have a handout?
So I don't have a handout for the talk per se. I do have a handout for the ants though. Dealing with the ants, if they're interested. And you can email me. And my email is Greg, Greg, at Calone Design, CalOwnDesign.com.
Well,
Kitty, if you want, I could
just
email that to you.
send it to me, and then I can make it available to everybody.
Absolutely. So guys, I'll do that. I'll just send it over to Kitty along with some before and after pictures, and she can distribute it out to you guys.
And you kept mentioning a nursery, moose ends or something. Could you
Okay,
give that
so
information too?
Yeah, so Moosa Creek Nursery there are two main wholesalers in San Diego County. It's Moosa Creek Nursery and Natives West, which is in Chula Vista, right near the border. Moosa Creek is in Valley Center. Both are typically typically wholesale nurseries. They'll supply plant sales. So the Native Plant Society has a twice yearly plant sale every year, which is also a big fundraiser for them, usually mid-October, and then I think the second one might be in March. However, if you want to buy plants from Moosa Creek Plants, what you can do is get on their website, which is moosacreeknursery.com, and you can actually look at their inventory online, order plants, pay for the plants online, and then have them delivered to whatever nursery they service that is closest to you. You just have to go pick them up. It's actually a really great way to do things. So that's moosacreeknursery.com. And you can look at their availability list. You can order plants through them, pay for them through them, and then designate where you want them delivered. And you can see a list of nurseries that they supply, and go get them.
That nursery, that site is currently offline. Hopefully it's temporary.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I was trying to get on there today. I don't know what's going on with that, but I'm sure that's a temporary thing because I know they're still in business and we're ordering plants from them.
So we can, as people can order plants from them, or are they wholesale only?
So you can't go in there and buy directly from them, but you can do the next best thing, which is you can get on their website. You can see what nurseries they service, which are a whole bunch of them. Figure out which one is closest to you, and then order through Moosa Creek and even pay for it online. And then they'll deliver your order to that nursery. You just have to go to the nursery and pick it up.
Okay, that sounds really good.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah. Really
And
easy.
everybody, you have the ability to unmute yourselves if you have questions,
Yeah.
or raise your hand and you're unmuted, Connie, speak.
I just wanted to say that I have called up and ordered things from Moosa Creek, and it's you're kind of worried you're buying a pig in a poke. You don't know what you're going to get. The plants are always beautiful. They do so well. They send out
Yeah.
good stuff.
Yeah, they don't mess around. The quality of their plants is excellent, especially for the retail customers. I tell them I don't care what they look like as long as they have roots. Any other questions, guys?
Do you personally do all kinds of hardscape, like decking and anything like that that you
Yeah,
run?
most of it, yeah. Yeah, we're pretty vertically integrated. So we, uh, the only thing that we've started going to subcontractors again for is concrete work as far as finished concrete, because there's so many potential issues with concrete that through no fault of your own, the batch, it might be a bad mix or bad coloring, bad colorant, you know, it gets pretty painful when you have to rip out a whole installation and do it again. So I'd rather the subcontractors who do it constantly and work with it constantly do that for us. But other than that, we do decks, we do flagstone, we do decomposed granite,
Gazebos? How about gazebos on a deck?
Yeah, we'll build gazebos. A lot of times we'll purchase a kit to just make it easier and quicker. But yeah, build them all the time, build overheads all the time, shade structures. Yep.
Okay.
And for any of you who don't have his book, this was the first book, the newer book with all those cool codes. I have somewhere, but I wasn't able to find it. So it looks back like the letters are backwards in the image.
No,
are they
from
not?
what I'm seeing, it looks the right way.
Okay, so I love this book anyway, but just
Thank
a
you.
little plug for Greg.
Thank you, I appreciate that. It was written as a textbook with Lucy Warren. Some of you guys know Lucy, and who's a brilliant writer, and it's been selling pretty well to this day. I think because our approach is very different than standard ornamental horticulture, and also because a lot of the books on natives are more plant encyclopedias than true horticultural design emphasis like that first book is. And it was kind of written as a textbook, and it's used in classes, for that purpose.
So another question is, my preferred garden design is English cottage. Now you might, I didn't see that one in your native.
Well, let's see. I got kind of one behind me here a little bit.
No, that's an English cottage style.
Kind of, English cottage is actually very easy. The reason that I don't do more English cottage is that English cottage are actually a tremendous amount of maintenance. And because they're full, the ratio of evergreens to perennials is off the charts. You usually have about 75 to 85 to 100% perennials and herbaceous subshrubs, and almost no backbone to it, which again can look like a riot of color in spring. And you can mix up blooming times to get things blooming pretty much all year long. But man, the deadheading you have to do to keep these things looking neat when they're done blooming, I don't get a lot of requests for them, just because it's a lot more maintenance intensive than people might realize. But I can do them. If you want them, I can do them.
What about mixing natives with succulents, or mixing natives with, I love succulents, I love irises.
Okay, so in general, if there is any parity in the water requirement, you can usually find a happy medium. So the types of non-native plants that I mix with them, yes, I will mix drought-tolerant succulents. A lot of succulents aren't that drought-tolerant, honestly, and like shade in that, but I'll mix drought-tolerant succulents that are non-invasive. Remember, native plants are not competitive plants. They won't crowd out typically, with a few exceptions, but in general, they won't crowd out other plants. If a plant is really aggressive, that plant will usually win. Okay, so I'm not putting a lot of small aloes and stuff around my natives, but there are other agaves and stuff that do just fine. As far as Mediterranean plants, a lot of Mediterranean plants will do fine with like your Baccharis, Ceanothus manzanitas. Leucadendrons will often do okay with natives, and proteas will often do okay with natives. Especially they want more mineralized soil, and they like more mineralized mulches. They're a little different animal that way, but they're very stress tolerant. But irises need a lot of water. So I would tend to put the non-native irises in a wetter part of the garden and devote a whole section just to the irises. We have native irises though, especially the Pacific coast, that are actually fairly drought tolerant by comparison, and evergreen, which is kind of cool. The other thing where there's a lot of compatibility, surprising, is bulbs. You can do, because bulbs generally are limited in the time of year they come up, when it's usually cooler and wetter, and our natives are adapted to receiving moisture then, and so they just tend to come up on their own. So I have daffodils all over my garden, no problem. Again, you just don't want to use stuff that's going to be really invasive and crowd out the natives, you know. But and we also have a tremendous variety, if you can get your hands on them, of native bulbs. We have beautiful varieties of native bulbs, like Mariposa lilies, like Brodeas, like Fritellias. That's incredible native bulbs that their specialty houses or the Native Plant Society will sometimes sell these bulbs, and you can just stick them out there in your landscape and pretty much forget about them. And but I use a lot of non-native bulbs too, no problem, just as long as they're not spreading and getting invasive. Oh, I didn't mention, as far as Mediterranean plants, the rosemary, lavender, Santolina, you know, the true sort of Mediterranean ecosystem, cistus, drought tolerant plants, I don't generally have too much problem. I tend to mix them more with endomycorrhizal natives than ecto. So even though cistus actually, turns out cistus is actually ectomycorrhizal, which is, you guys could probably care less, but for us plant nerds, it's interesting because ectomycorrhizae inhabits pine and oak woodland. And yet here's this ancient plant from the Mediterranean, and we also have native rock roses. They're all ectomycorrhizal. It's very strange that way. So you could grow cistus around pine trees. I've never tried them around manzanita, but my hunch is they probably do okay. But I don't put so many in here that I knock out the native ecology. They're accents and highlights mostly.
So you really don't recommend alyssum? It smells so good, and somebody was recommending it earlier for getting rid of whitefly.
Oh yeah, it kills everything. Even the whitefly don't want to have anything to do with it. Yeah, it's really funny when you'll see these wildflower mixes, especially native wildflower mixes, but they'll mix in a little bit of alyssum because they know it's a sure thing and it's pretty and it smells nice, and they know it'll come up for sure. And then by the second year, they wonder why it's all alyssum and nothing else. Yeah, it's a problem. It is. They secrete They secrete cyanide into the soil, hydrogen cyanide compounds, and that kills the mycorrhizal fungi that support the native plants, and it knocks out the plant community, and then they just take over. Kills the wildflowers, kills everything. That's why they're so aggressive. So yeah, if you want to contain it in a pot or a different part of the yard where they won't spread the natives, fine, you know.
Good to know. I have a lot of it.
Yeah, that's one we target.
They look so dainty. They look so dainty, and they give you that cottage look.
I
Oh,
know,
yeah,
they smell nice.
Dangerous things come in pretty packages sometimes.
But I guess there's the low-growing verbena that you could use for that dainty look. That they're drought tolerant, and
Yeah, that works.
I have some of that around too.
Mm-hmm. But we also have a lot of natives too that are low-growing perennials that also have some pretty cool looks to them, like some of the little daisies and stuff that some of the little buckwheats. We have these little little tiny perennial buckwheats that have red flowers or golden flowers or white flowers that have sort of powder puff flowers on them that are held above the foliage. They're just beautiful. Eriogonum undulatum, Grande rubescens, I forget the other one, but anyway, they're only, the plants themselves are only about 6 inches high, and then they hold these beautiful flowers that also dry really nicely too.
I'm trying to think, that daisy that you showed, was that a Santa Barbara daisy?
No, run the
Okay,
other
what-
direction.
Okay,
Yeah.
because it looks similar. So
Well, you're actually onto something because they're both erigerons. But the erigeron carvicanensis, or whatever it's called, that Santa Barbara daisy is, despite its name, not native to Santa Barbara. It's not native to California. It's actually, I believe, Mexico, Central America. It is highly invasive. It really will take over. However, the seaside daisy, as you might have noticed, yes, it is also an erigeron, and they are cultivar selections and hybrids of Erigeron glaucus, which is the seaside daisy, and it grows on coastal bluffs from about Ventura County north.
okay, so that one's okay.
It's very nice, very
Okay.
well behaved, very neat. With all the mounding perennials, you do want to just kind of be aware of the ant situation, keep the ants under
Oh,
control.
I know all about ants.
Yeah, yeah, so do I. I'll tell you.
I told my husband, every one of those weeds that you posted that the ants plant, we have all of them.
Well, it's funny because you start to see them coming up right around the base of the plants. And then you'll start to see them kind of following the ant trails, and usually they lead back to the neighbor's fence. And that's where they're coming from. And it's astounding how quickly and how massively they can plant these weeds. That picture I showed you, that carpet of brass buttons, that wasn't there the year before. And the following year, it was a solid carpet of this stuff. And I look in and you see these ants just crawling all through it, just crawling all through it. And they drop the seed, they eat the attachment point, they drop the seed. And the significance of having weeds coming up in the base of a plant that they're infesting is that when they've killed that plant, they can then jump to the weeds and sustain themselves.
Mm.
And sometimes, if you ever pulled out a spurge, and all of a sudden your hand is covered in ants, okay? If you have that cap and look at the root, and you'll often see scale all along the taproot. And they're doing the same thing to those weeds that they do to the native plants.
Mealybugs too.
Mealies are secondary. They come in because the ants have pulverized the soil to aerate it. So, because these are all air-breathing scale and aphids, right? So they create these galleries, and the soil becomes very loose and pulverized. And then the mealybugs have no problem moving in, and they will eat some of the root, but they'll also eat the detritus and the dying roots and things like that the ants leave behind. But a lot of times the primary, and this is what's really been not really been strongly researched, or people have not been strongly aware of, because they always see ants and aphids as being sort of, the ants and aphids just sort of blow in on the wind and find the plant, and then the ants kind of happen along and sort of by chance find these aphids and scale, and they start farming them. Well, unfortunately, the truth is that they place the baby scale in most cases all over the roots, and then they go up into the scaffolding. So by the time the ants and aphids are into the scaffolding of the plant, they've long infested the root ball. And so they're already weakening and killing the plant below ground. And because it's not right there in front of your face, people just didn't make the connection. And the conventional wisdom was that the ants aren't motivating, they're not pulling or placing and transporting these sucking insects. They're just happening along and taking advantage of it opportunistically. But you have to ask yourself, how does scale and that coverage and magnitude get all over a root that is bonded to soil, okay? They don't have ways to dig in there and that. They're just these barely modal things that just have to come in there. Well, the ants could do all the excavation first, set up the galleries, and then start hanging the scale and hanging the aphids, which attach and start developing. They groom them. If they don't take the honeydew, which is what they're farming, the scale will actually suffocate itself with all the honeydew they're secreting. And then they take the babies and they move them to new places. So they're amazing farmers. I have begrudging respect for Argentine ants because they are so amazingly adapted and they are true agricultural farmers. But boy, because of that, they are now the #1 invasive pest, insect pest in the world. They occupy all continents but Antarctica, and they're now moving up as far as Washington state. So that's pretty bad. So we've got to start. I'm educating because I want people to take them seriously so that there'll be research done. The USDA will start to develop biocontrols. The only biocontrol we had for back when they came in 1906, the San Diego Zoo would actually rent you an aardvark for a week. They would actually rent you
You're
an
kidding.
anteater. Not kidding. They would rent you an anteater for a week. Yeah. Isn't that wild? Too bad it didn't work. So it's a problem. They
Yeah,
really are
I-
literally the root of all evil.
I used your the Advient in the house quite a bit, but I ended up calling my local pest control company when it got bad.
Yeah, well, pest control, they spray the foundation, which is what they're licensed to do. And
Right.
that usually creates a barrier. So what I do, and part of my treatment strategy I didn't mention, was I'll take just the pyrethrin or pyrethroid and I'll create a barrier spray soak around the perimeter of the yard and subdivide areas of the yard so that you divide and conquer and you're not killing all your neighbors' ants coming in to replace them.
Uh-huh.
So that's an important part, but don't mix in the other ingredients. They're expensive. You save that for the plants. But the pyrethroid itself is relatively inexpensive. And if you do a root soak or do a perimeter soak out there, that'll pretty much keep them at bay for about 3 months, so. And it's nice because when you get into this treatment, then they don't come into your house anymore either. So they're gone, they're done.
Right. Well, my pest control people told me they'd gone after the queen as well. They did something or other.
They probably used a slow acting bait like
Right.
Avion that gets taken down into there and hopefully it worked,
Well, it's been a good year without ants, but I'm sure they'll be back.
Yeah, well, the thing is, they don't come in the house, but they're still out in the yard killing your plants, and people just don't make the connection between the little brown ants that come into your house and them also killing all your plants out there because of their various strategies. They're amazing survivors. They're just amazingly adapted.
Well, I really liked your tip about when I see grass, like I've been seeing grass growing in some of my herbs. My thyme plant has all these little grass growing and it's not looking well. So now I figure I know what the problem is.
Well, do your root soak. You could actually just, if you have so for me, I get the best results when I mix the 3 components together because unfortunately, only the first part of it is the attack and the appropriation of moisture and sugars underground from the root system. But the second point is that they're inoculating with pathogens. They're little typhoid Marys. And it's direct inoculation right into the root system, right? Underground. So they're bringing in Phytophthora, they're bringing in Fusarium, they're bringing in Botrytis, there's association with downy mildew and powdery mildew. A lot of times when it gets on your roses, look, and there are ants all over it and they're dumping the spore all over the leaves. So the ants literally are the root of all evil. And they bring in these diseases and these root diseases, and they have been researched and studied bringing Phytophthora in avocados and citrus. Okay, so they know they do that. So the other component, the neem oil, is really important for helping the disease, and then the Super Thrive helps stimulate the roots. You could do each of these separately on your herb. You could go in there with a pyrethroid and do a root soak just to kill the active infestation. Then you could give it a little neem oil treatment, and then you could give it a little Super Thrive treatment. It's the same thing. But I have like bucket drench formulas also in my.
Well, I look forward to your sending me that stuff.
Okay,
We kept you far too long. Anyone else have questions? I don't mean to monopolize him, but I've been fascinated.
yeah, I actually have a chiropractor appointment I need to get to. So I'm propped up in my chair here, but my back's not doing so great. So yeah.
Thank you.
Second
That's
time in
very
3 weeks, so
informative.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm
Greg. It
glad
was
you
We're
guys.
great.
all clapping our hands up here.
Super
Thank
great.
you
Yeah,
so much, Greg.
definitely.
This is
Y'all.
really, really informative.
I
really
enjoyed sharing it with you, and I appreciate your interest. And I'll go ahead and send that information to you, Kitty.
Thank you, and I can share it with the club.
That sounds good. Okay, guys. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Well, I hope everybody had a good time.
That's great. Super great.
He's just really good.
Yep.
I just love looking at his pictures, love hearing him talk. I love his books too.
Yep.
Yeah, well,
Thanks.
off to kill some ants.
Off to
I
plant
feel
some
like
stuff.
I need to replace all the dirt and plants in my whole yard now.
I know the feeling.
I'm gonna try his plant soak on the plant. I'm pretty sure that's the ants are getting to.
Oh,
Yeah.
man.
There's all this grass growing out of the base, and now I understand why it's looking so bad.
Well, I have some aeoniums by the front door in pots, and I noticed some white, like some mealy bugs on them. But you don't think that down in the dirt, that they could be, even if you spray it with the alcohol on, that.
Yeah, that's what I usually do. I just sort of take them off individually.
So I don't know, but I don't know, because we have a major problem, like I said, in all those weeds that he showed pictures of. I'm like, yep.
Well, I had ag pest control out when my ant problem just got totally out of hand, and it's been a whole lot better for about a year now. But as he said, what they did is they did the base of the house.
So, yeah.
So they wouldn't come in, and then they did something so they take it back to the queen, and I haven't seen these lines of marching ants that I used to see.
Yeah.
The other thing people recommend is I put down a trail of cinnamon on their usual marching line, and that kills them too.
When I would water, they just come up in droves, and anyway. Well, we'll have to work on that this year. It's the ant year, Mark. Come on, war on ants here this year.
Laura, bye. Thank you for being here.
Bye. See you guys.
See all of you. I really, really enjoyed your company as always.
See ya.
See ya.